Thou shalt not sow with two different seeds, the ultimate guide. We have two verses in the Old Testament that talk about mixing seeds, fabrics, animals. They are in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. It says, "You shall not let your cattle breed with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed, nor shall you wear a garment of cloth made of two kinds of material." In Deuteronomy it says, "You shall not sow your vineyard with two kinds of seed, lest the whole yield be forfeited, the crop that you have sown and the yield of the vineyard." In some translations it says that the crop would be defiled. Now the basic explanation that comes to mind is that God doesn't want us to create new hybrids, accidentally or intentionally, through cross-pollination. Because according to God, everything is supposed to reproduce after its own kind. Now, these verses are also an argument against the evolution. They are in Genesis 1:11. "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants, fruit trees, each according to its kind." Vegetation sprouts after its own kind. Grass produces more grass. Maple trees produce maple trees. Dogs produce dogs, and cats produce cats. And God doesn't want us to mess with that. The creation is done, it is finished, and doesn't need an improvement from scientists. Thank you very much, says God. God doesn't need new species popping up because of us mixing seeds. That would be one simple explanation of those commandments from the Old Testament. However, different vegetables won't cross-pollinate just like that. If we plant two different plants next to each other, they will not cross-pollinate easily. They will only cross-pollinate when they are the same genus and species, and if they go to seed. Now, what's genus and species? In botanical classification, it's family, genus, species, and then variety. So we need to look at their Latin names. For example, cabbage in Latin is Brassica oleracea, and broccoli is also Brassica oleracea. The first word is the genus, and the second word is the species. So broccoli and cabbage are of the same genus and the same species, so they can create a new vegetable. Usually they won't, if you don't let them go to seed, but they could. However, broccoli will not mix with other vegetables like carrots. Carrots could only mix with other carrots. And there are many varieties of carrots, but they are all carrots. And that's probably all that God created, one carrot type. People created other varieties. Corn will only cross-pollinate with corn. Cucumber with other cucumbers. Cucumbers won't even cross-pollinate with squash or melon, although they seem to be in the same family. And like I said, even plants with the same genus and species can be prevented from cross-pollination if you don't let them go to seed. Now, on the internet, you can find out which plants can cross-pollinate, and you will see that it is rare. Creating hybrids is not that easy. For example, people created a hybrid of wheat and rye. It's called triticale. They succeeded, but it was difficult. It had to be done in a lab. The hybrid of wheat and rye would not reproduce. The resulting mix was sterile and had to be treated in vitro with chemicals to reproduce. It had a low survival rate of the embryo. It had spontaneous chromosome doublings, and botanists finally succeeded, but earlier triticale hybrids had reproductive disorders. Seems like God built in safeguards to prevent his creation from being corrupted. Another example of this is mixing horses and donkeys, and people have been doing that forever despite the prohibition in Leviticus 19:19. You shall not let your cattle breed with different kind. And the resulting offspring is a mule. And you know what? Almost every mule grows up to be sterile. They cannot reproduce. So creating hybrids is not that easy. I'm saying this so that we don't have to worry too much about messing up God's creation. It won't happen just like that. It won't happen just because you planted carrots next to broccoli. They won't mix. And it's the same when it comes to vineyards, it would seem. I read that different varieties of grapes may cross-pollinate, but we have two different grape bushes next to each other. One is dark blue, one is white, and they haven't mixed. The blue produces blue grapes, and the other bush produces white grapes only. So the law in Deuteronomy 22:9 may be talking about growing plants other than grapes in the vineyard next to grapes. So why do we have these laws in the Bible? I don't think God's intention was to make gardening practically impossible. Because if we were to follow these laws strictly, we would be condemned to monoculture. Say hello to a field of potatoes and nothing else. That just doesn't seem right. So what's the answer? There's a very basic practicality in these laws. Throwing seeds together, not in rows next to each other, but actually mixing them up, shaking them up in a cup and throwing them on the ground together would create a mishmash of different plants. It is sort of what Jesus warned about in Matthew 13 when we read that Satan plants weeds among cultivated plants. It speaks of a man who sowed good seed in his field, but the enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat. This is the parable of wheat and tares. So if you had all the vegetables, all the seeds mixed up like that, shaken together, it would be very messy. The result would be very messy and difficult to cultivate. So the Bible might be talking not about sowing seeds next to each other, but literally among each other when it's warning us about not mixing seeds. It seems very basic not to throw all kinds of seeds together on the ground. Nobody would do that today, creating a mess of mixed up growth. But maybe, just maybe, God had to spell it out for the first generation of Hebrew farmers. Maybe God had to be very clear. Separate the seeds for planting. There is another possibility that these laws are about GMO plants and animals, that they were given only for the latter days, for the last generations, for the end times, close to the end, as people learned how to manipulate and edit genes. Since the 1970s, the so-called scientists have been coming up with weirder and weirder inventions. And in the sphere of farming, it started with tangelos and proceeded to cloning. And now they create fruits and vegetables not seen previously, and new creatures engineered in labs. We not only have a cross between wheat and rye, the triticale, but also all sorts of GMO frankenfoods, such as chickens with human genes. Yes, they do exist. British scientists have created a breed of genetically modified hens that produce cancer-fighting medicines in their eggs. Those animals, they have human genes added to their DNA so that human proteins are secreted into the whites of their eggs. In Canada, they came up with 2.0 apples, GMO apples, that never go brown when sliced. And there are also cows with human genes that give human milk. So I refuse to grow or consume any GMO creations, tangelos, triticale, or GMO plants or animals. But there is this possibility that the laws about mixing seeds are written for the people who edit genes and change God's creation on fundamental cellular level, which is happening now, because there was no genetic editing in the Old Testament times. So it's possible that the laws were written for us today. So these are the physical level considerations about mixing seeds from the Old Testament. However, it is entirely possible that the meaning of these laws is spiritual. So as a segue to the spiritual, let's look at the vineyard commandment, Deuteronomy 22:9. Thou shalt not sow thy vineyard with two different seeds, lest the fruit of thy seed which thou hast sown and the fruit of thy vineyard be defiled. Vineyard was a very special place in Israel. Grapes were one of the three major crops next to olives and wheat, one of the staples. Also, spiritually, Israel was compared to a vineyard in God's kingdom, Psalm 80. And grapes produce wine, which is a symbol of Jesus' blood, which is the highest offering. So it is especially important not to defile the blood of Christ. And the Bible simply points us to this truth. I believe there's a spiritual level meaning in these laws, which is paramount. In the Bible, every commandment, every parable has at least two levels of meaning, the physical and spiritual. So we looked at the physical, now let's move on to the spiritual. I believe that these laws about mixing seeds are not about mixing seeds. Is that possible? Absolutely, it's possible. We have other verses like that in the Old Testament, and they are interpreted in the New Testament to mean something completely different. Such as the ox treading the grain was not about the ox treading the grain. We read about that in 1 Corinthians 9:9. It is written in the law of Moses, and that's the Old Testament, obviously, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake. So Paul says that the law about the ox working and being able to eat during working is not for the sake of the ox, but for the sake of Christian workers like himself. So by the same token, mixing two different seeds is not about mixing two different seeds, but about mixing worldviews, ideas, about separation. It is about separation. These laws, they point us to eternal spiritual truths. Christians should not mix with the world. Church ideas should not mix with world ideas. Christians should not be friends with non-Christians, close friends. Christians should not marry non-Christians, which is prohibited in another spot in the New Testament. It says, do not be unequally yoked with non-believers. Notice, yoked. This is the prohibition is also in agricultural terms. What is yoked? It refers to farming, to using animals to plow the field or to grind grains for oil, etc. You would put a yoke on 2 donkeys or 2 bulls, and they would do the work. But you were supposed to use the same animals under the same yoke, not a smaller donkey and a big bull used as a pair, but have them equally yoked. It's a farming example. And it is applied to marriage, to human relationships, to business, personal life, church ministry. It doesn't apply to donkeys. Now, these laws might apply a little bit on the basic physical level, but look what Paul said. Again, Paul said, does God not certainly speak for our sake? In other translations, it says, in Geneva, it says, either said he it not altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, it is written. So according to the Bible, the thing about oxen treading grain, God said it certainly, altogether, no doubt, for our sakes, for the sake of pastors, Christian workers. That's what Paul explained. The Old Testament laws, they often point us to a spiritual reality which has precedence over the physical. The working ox is about working pastors. Separating seeds is about separating people. We are not to mix with the world. We're not to bring yoga into church. We're not to mix Islam with Christianity into Chrislam. We're not to mix world religions. It's a prohibition against syncretism. Because we are God's people, holy, different, separate. Separate the seeds. The seeds need to be separate. And the seed is often a symbol of people, of children who grow up to rule. That would be us. The seed can mean people, vineyard can mean Israel, grapes point us to the blood of Jesus, and that's why the offering from the vineyard, from the grapes, must not be defiled. God said to Abraham, your seed will possess the land. That's Abraham's children, his seed. Also, Deuteronomy 10:15, the Lord had a delight in thy fathers to love them, and he chose their seed, their children, after them, above all people. And not every seed will possess the land. We will rule with Christ, but not every seed will rule with Christ. We are holy, and holy means separate. We are to be set apart. That's the reality that was drilled. It was drilled into the Hebrews in simple agricultural terms, in terms they could understand. And did you notice that the Bible talks about 2 seeds? It says, you shall not sow your field with 2 kinds of seed. 2. Some translations are not very clear about it, and that's the fault of the translators. But when you look at the original Hebrew, it's clear that the Bible means 2 different seeds. Also, the fabrics mentioned are 2 different fabrics, wool and linen. Also, the cattle involves 2 animals, and the seeds spoken about are 2. Now, a garden could have 20 different vegetables, 20 different seeds, but both Deuteronomy and Leviticus, they talk about 2 seeds. The word for 2 different seeds is klaim, and according to Hebrew scholars, that means dual, as in 2, in the sense of separation. 2 heterogeneities. Hetero means different, geneieties is related to genes. So 2 different types. There are always 2 types, aren't there? Of seeds, of people. In the Bible, it was Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau. Saved and unsaved, liars and truth tellers. And that's why those laws, they say 2 different seeds instead of 15 different vegetables. 2, like wheat and tares, good ones and bad ones. And the wheat will be gathered into God's barn, and tares will be burned with fire. Satan sows weeds, and he's quite good at it, but as far as it is up to us, as much as we can help it, we should keep the seeds separate. We should keep ourselves separate from the world. So first of all, keep your biblical worldview pure. Keep your faith clean. Don't mix it with secular ideas. But when it comes to planting squash next to carrots and companion planting, there is no prohibition against it, because in most cases they are not going to cross-pollinate. But obviously don't use GMO seeds, because those are already mixed in an unnatural way. That's messing with God's creation. Say no to mules, that's clear in the Bible, mating horses and donkeys. Say no to triticale, because that's just strange that it wouldn't grow by itself. It needs chemicals. It's kind of like GMO almost. And avoid all the other GMO seeds and plants. Sometimes you may need to preserve the purity of your seeds, your specific cultivars or varieties. Some of them need to be planted apart, but most of them won't cross-pollinate. But, you may want to plant broccolis apart from cabbage, a couple of things like that. You may need some distance in a few cases, but that's not what these laws are really about. One powerful reason these laws cannot be talking about cross-pollination is that cross-pollination will not happen in nature, naturally, with 2 diverse seeds. And the Bible is talking about 2 diverse seeds, 2 different seeds here. And cross-pollination will only happen with seeds from the same genus and species, from the same plant family. You don't need a half-a-mile buffer zone between corn and carrots. You need a half-a-mile buffer zone from the lies of the world. You may need a half-a-mile buffer between you and your yoga practicing neighbor, rather than between squash and melon. Because the main purpose of these laws is to be separate and holy for the Lord. That's the message that God is communicating. Thank you for listening, and happy gardening. Be separate.